Live.
Cool. Hey, everybody. This is the Web Server Frameworks team meeting for August 20th. And so we have a fairly short agenda. I don't think anybody has updates on the two agenda items, but we wanted to have a little chat on how the discussion around the next 10-year plan is, and then sort of provide some feedback, I think, from this group, which is making some pretty ambitious plans. And I think it would be really valuable for us to discuss that, see it, make sure that we think what is happening over in that discussion fits with where we're going. And then, I was thinking if, Michael's been leading that conversation and I wasn't sure he was going to be able to attend here, but maybe he could give a sort of a rundown, and then we can, have how do we fit into that. And then when we go back to those discussions, I think later today, maybe we can have some concrete things that say like, hey, this is what the Web Server Frameworks team has been discussing around this. We're making some really ambitious plans for the next 10 year with, rewriting effectively all of the HTTP stack. And if there's any feedback we can provide. So that was kind of where I was thinking. Does anybody have anything else to add to the agenda for today before we get started? No? Okay. So anyway, updates on technical plan or organizational plan. I don't think there are any. I don't have any, and nobody chimed up. So are we good to leave those on the agenda since they're sort of our primary topic items? But then we'll just sort of move on to the, how do those relate to the 10-year plan? Yeah. Okay. Well, Michael, do you want to maybe give sort of the high level? And yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, at a very high level, we hit the 10-year anniversary earlier in the year, and it seemed like a good time to reflect on, what made Node so successful for the first 10 years. What were the key things on the technical front, which, meant that led to that success? And then what do we need to do for the next 10 years to make sure we continue to have that same level of success? As you mentioned, so far the discussions have been focused on kind of some of the values, but that's meant to lay the groundwork in terms of, in my perfect world, what this would look like is the project having here are the end things we think are important to the success of Node in the next 10 years or 5 years or whatever, and then here is what we're doing on each of those to, to try and make sure that those happen. Being volunteer driven, it's not like we can make a project plan and assign work to people, but I still think it's worthwhile having that view as a project that, what do we think is important for our future as we go forward? And, use that to encourage people who, they don't really have a preference where they work to work in those areas, and also to support efforts. So for example, if we think it's crucial to the success for Node going forward to do the HTTP rewrite that you're talking about, use it as a way to support those and to, have them on people's radar so that when the PRs come in, people are like, oh, okay, well, I understand that this work is going on. I understand that the project has said that it's crucial to our future, and therefore let's support making that move forward. So that's where that's going. And, today we're at the beginning of the first thing we agreed we needed to do was come up with, the values of technical values in terms of like, how would we make decisions as to whether something should be brought in, not brought in, what's important. And then once we've got through that, we'll move back to discussions in some of the technical areas. We'd start a little bit in the session in the Collaborator Summit to say, well, what are some of the areas that we think are important, like, say WebAssembly or TypeScript and those kind of things, like, going back to identifying what are the key technical areas that we think we need to put some energy into to continue to be successful.
So one of the things I thought was interesting that came out of last week's discussion, Matteo was talking about the sort of contention between stability and innovation, I guess is the way I kind of think of it. So he was saying like some of the things we were putting at really high value in that conversation was the things like stability, what were like the LTS plan. And and there's sort of a natural contention when you look at adopting new technologies. And what I really think of here is like our HTTP2 work really was, trying to, and now the 3 is really trying to push us toward the forefront of these adopting of new technologies before our users are really saying, yeah, we need these, we want these, we have to have them today. And so I wonder, and because of our commitment to stability, we've really struggled to have those APIs work correctly and well. And it ended up that our users just went the stable route, right? Which is using the HTTP2 compat layer. So I wonder if anybody else has any good, feedback on whether, how that's played out with these particular decisions. And then if there's maybe any changes that we could have made back then that we should, look at when we're making new decisions around this in the future. Like, do we want, anyway, I'm sort of rambling now, but I think it's a really interesting, I think the HTTP2 work is one that I think really we should analyze deeply on how this, how we value these things.
Right now, the top value still ended up being the user experience, right?
Yeah.
And then followed by those stability, and so I think that's the place where we could still see that being driving the innovation part. Like if the user experience is stale. But I think your comment about HTTP2 is a very interesting one, in that it's if it was like, if nobody uses it, then it wasn't critical to the user experience, I don't think. And either or we have a major gap because we did it wrong, or
I mean,
Well,
one of the reasons it never really took off, wasn't it, that because like Nginx didn't have a free version of it, something along those lines. I think Matteo mentioned that in one of the meetings.
That is true, and I believe it is still true. But but okay. So, and then maybe that leads into the discussion of how do we, when usage of a feature in Node Core is predicated on it working well in an infrastructure that might not support what you would need to run it in production. Should we be considering those sort of external factors in decision making? Like, maybe this would have been I'm playing devil's advocate here because I think we should be supporting HTTP2 and all that and moving toward 3. But there's some of this argument could be, well, because the ecosystem that we're building in doesn't have good support here, maybe we shouldn't have ever built HTTP2 into core, and maybe we shouldn't be doing 3. That's, again, devil's advocate, because I disagree with that. But
the middle ground might have been, maybe we should have waited longer. I mean, right, like if he'd waited and started looking at it now, we wouldn't necessarily have the issue of we have an API but want to change it, right?
The way I see it, I mean, I wasn't involved in HTTP2 that much more than just about the end before it was going out of experimental. But if we look at it now, I think that effort would have been better spent at fixing the HTTP1 stuff before going onwards with the next level, because we kind of build. I mean, that's why we're discussing now that take a few steps back and do it from scratch properly, and not just build upon half maintained stuff. We want to innovate, but we still need to have the groundwork for it. What we already have needs to work well before we take another step. I don't know. And another problem I see with adding new stuff like HTTP2 is, do we have sufficient people that are willing to maintain it? I mean, I see a little problem here with the stuff James is working on, because what happens if he's no longer working on it?
Right, you mean all the quick, and it's fairly far out, just because it's a similar situation where there's a dependency, I think, on OpenSSL supporting APIs, and until they actually do, it can't really become production ready, right?
I don't think this is gonna be. I'm just theorizing it because now James is working on it and everybody's leaving him to do it because he's on top of it. And I'm sure once OpenSSL and it gets more stable, etc., more people will be very interested in working on it. I'm one of those. But it's just a factor to keep in mind that when we add new stuff, there's usually one hero that pushes for it and does most of the work, but we need to have more people interested to continue that effort before we add such a big thing into Node.
Right.
Yeah, I think I really like the way you were talking about the rewrite of HTTP 1. In a perfect world, we would have went back and done that as a part of the first iteration of HTTP 2, right? And I think that what that says to me is that one of the values we maybe didn't rate high enough in our discussion was the maintainer developer experience, right? The node core maintainer. We when everybody, obviously everybody says, oh, you have 3 dots to put on the values. Almost everybody's going to put one on developer experience for end developers, and then they're going to prioritize docs and stuff like that over the maintainer experience. But look, we didn't have a good maintainer experience, and because of that, we were unable to deliver a good user experience for the end user of HTTP2. And then it made more work on the developers to go back and implement a compat layer because we just didn't have the maintainer experience for this sorted up front. So I wonder if maybe we should go back and say, hey, well, if you don't fix the foundation, your house is not going to be great, right? So like the foundation really is the developer experience contributing to Node. What APIs do we have? How are they structured? Are they the right the right code to solve that problem, right? And like get that right first before we add new innovative support. Actually, to me, this sort of feels a little bit like modules, the ESM stuff as well, right? Is like we landed experimental support before the developer experience was very good, and it's been really difficult for them to push these changes in because they had trouble setting the right foundation. I don't know, maybe I'm going off on but anyway, I do think
there is also the risk of you never get anything in too. I think is like on the module side, it's not like that was stuck in a few months. There was like years, I think, of work went in. So I'm just thinking out loud in terms of like, you also want to make sure you don't keep refactoring what you've got and end up adding nothing new.
Yeah, no, sure. But I mean, in some cases, you get to a point where nobody wants to touch the code.
No, yeah, I'm not saying don't refactor. I'm just musing like on the module side of things, like and Wes, were you talking about the maintainer experience or the end user experience?
Well, yeah, I was saying I think in this case, we can say that the maintainer experience, so the inability to make changes effectively in the HTTP 1 API to move it to a better place as a foundation to share with the HTTP 2 API, meant that we forked internally the code in such a way that it makes it really unmaintainable, which in some ways means that we weren't able to continue to innovate there, making the user experience better in the true HTTP2 API, which means that everybody who uses it really just uses the HTTP compat layer, HTTP1 compat layer for it, which means that we never got the user experience correct in the HTTP2 implementation. But to touch any of them is really difficult because of this big forking.
Right. Okay. I mean,
right, like so it was an offshoot. The developer, the end user experience is the way it is today because the maintainer experience they weren't able, at the time to make the risky decisions because the foundation wasn't correct. Is the way I understand.
Right. Yeah, like I could see it's harder. It's harder to, you can have a code base that makes it easier or harder to get, new protocols and all that kind of stuff in. And it wasn't well positioned for that. I'm not sure if that's related to why HTTP 2 or 2 is not used. Like it seems one of the factors is like people use just still HTTP 1 or the compat layer because there's no real motivator to use HTTP 2 because it's terminated at Nginx and doesn't come back to Node anyway, right?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I think
I'm not really sure. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So sorry, I mean, there are two things here. One is, why isn't it used more by our end users?
Yep.
That's one question. Why isn't it more, developed and maintained by our collaborators? That's another story. And of course, they're intervened, but I think looking at both of those sides is important. And I do think the maintainer story is missing a little bit in the values documents. And
right, and so that's the first cut. So we should comment.
Yeah,
and
I
we'll
will leave a
discuss
comment
that more. We'll discuss more. Continue the discussion today in the meeting. That's where we're going to pick up and see where we go with that.
But going back to a little bit to our previous discussions here, where talking about taking a few steps back and doing it properly, this discussion reinforces at least my opinion on that's a good idea. Because if we further fork the maintainer experience, we end up with no maintainers on any part. So unifying that, I believe, could be long-term very good for the project.
I think having, like, I think what you're talking about too is that we'll end up with a set of APIs that you can offer HTTP 1, 2, 3, and continue to use those, right?
Yeah.
Is that the?
I mean, from a user perspective, it's the same APIs, and from a developer, maintainer perspective, it's this. I mean, the same implementation, right, or similar implementation.
Yeah. That I definitely believe, like having, I mean, I think that helps with adoption, that helps with the first priority, which is the consumer experience is, okay, no, I don't have to do something different, or I don't have to change, or.
Yep. And I mean, another thing to mention about HTTP2, I don't know if this is true, at least it's my feeling, is since the maintainers are not that excited about HTTP2, me as a user become a little bit scared about, should I really be using this or not? How well maintained is it?
So while I agree that can be an issue, I'm not entirely sure that that's a broad scale issue. Like I think folks connected to the ecosystem may have that, and it certainly played into our discussions in Express about how much work do we want to put into supporting it, because if it's one person in Node Core, then suddenly there's bugs, then do we now have to fix them since we added it to Express? Everybody's going to come to us. They're not going to go to Node Core when they have a bug, right? So like those kind of discussions really do play into how widely, maybe not widely, how deep in the stack you're willing to offer the feature and support, and where you put the code. Anyway, I think this plays into a lot, and I think this is one of the things I hope to get out of bringing this up in this context was taking some feedback back to that conversation, and no one put their dot next to maintainer experience, I don't think, when we did that exercise that Matteo recommended. Mm-hmm. And to me, this is like, for this group, I think one thing we should take back to that conversation really is, hey, look, if we don't have a good maintainer experience, we're going to have one maintainer for all these core main features, and that's not long-term viable. That's not going to help the project at all. We need to make sure that the maintainer experience is valued highly, and because that wasn't brought up. Well,
If there's no maintainer, then the other points, nobody will work on them.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now I'm always surprised how few people there are on anything. And so like, I agree one isn't good, but I don't think we're going to have like 10 maintainers of any one thing either. So it's some small number, like, count on one hand or less that's going to be, I think, the case for any particular area.
But it's also, over time, maybe you only have 2 or 3 people that are interested at one time of a specific module, but someone loses interest and someone gains interest.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess it's kind of like when you get a new feature, you're right that it's often like somebody's super interested. How do you validate that there's greater interest? And I think that when you go to the next 10 years, when we get to the technical part, that should a little bit be the filter, is like there's some big new technical thing. If it's on our list of things we think is strategic for Node and success, then it makes sense. If it's some big new thing, but it's not on that list, less so, right?
So, but then it comes to the way that list is constructed. I feel like there's one has to come first, right? So the values need to be set, and then what is on that list of things needs to fit
reflect
with
those values. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that we may. It's hard to say how a decision would be made, and it's really easy to point fingers at the past. So I'm not saying we can look at HTTP2 all we want and say, well, why does nobody use it? It's like, well, we might not have known that. We thought that everybody was benefits seem great, and it's like, cool. But I do think there's some level of we need a proof of concept that gains traction in the ecosystem before we invest heavily. We can invest lightly. We can make sure that things aren't going to make it impossible to implement in the future without going and saying, no, we have this API. It is stable. We've went through all the legwork to support it, right? Like we can do, we can say we don't support it, but we interrupt really well with this userland module, right? Or like there's a lot of ways we can go about structuring when somebody's super interested. So here's one, like, for example, I'm thinking a lot about the policy API lately, which I have not seen a single person use.
What is that?
Yeah, exactly. I've had a bunch of conversations internally at Netflix where I bring it up and no one knows about it. and it's like one person's passion project, which is fine. And I think that's great. Should that be supported by Node Core? I'm not sure. Like, I know that there's certain hooks with that are maybe required in Node Core, but until you have a clear signal that there will be users who are very interested and will pick it up and use it as soon as you offer it, I think we should be much more conservative on landing those things, right? So I think of like RimRaf, it's like, get that into core as fast as you possibly can. Everybody's going to use that. It's hugely popular as a third-party module, right? Like HTTP2 didn't have that. Like there was some speedy usage, and gRPC folks were a little bit on it because like that was part of the gRPC thing, but all of those could have been done as native add-on modules just fine, right? And had we waited longer, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now with HTTP2. And I think about things like the policy API in that regard. I think about the things like HTTP3, I think is going to be another example of this. We're actually waiting much longer is going to be just better, right? If people can use it as a third party add-on, if it's a binary dependency, whatever, for a year, and then we see a huge adoption, then awesome. Then we've gotten that signal that like it is ready to be made a official part of core, even if it's the same maintainers doing it under the node governance, but as a third-party module, which is sort of our plan with this HTTP work.
Right.
To me, that actually fits really well with like the value of highly valuing user experience and developer experience, maintainer experience, because the maintainers get a lot of freedom by being outside of Node Core. They can iterate quickly. They're not tied to the LTS schedule and all these things. But at the same time, the user experience of it gets solid before we bring it in. And right. And to me, that is like a really good approach, which I think was our plan here.
Also, I would like to add, we land stuff in Node as experimental. I do think it would be a good policy to have that we don't bring something out of experimental if there's not enough, maintainer, not enough collaborators actively working on it. So we don't have, a one-person thing that goes into Node stable.
Yeah, that's an interesting, like one of the exit. Usually there's exit criteria put together, but enough, like some minimum number of maintainers would be an interesting one.
But I mean, that's still landed, right?
Yeah, or even before that then.
Yeah.
I mean, and people's willingness to use experimental APIs in production code is like unbounded. I'm serious. I mean, that little warning doesn't mean hardly anything to me. And I'm concerned about these things more than most, I think.
Some people are quite concerned about that, but they do get used, which then includes some back pressure, right?
And as soon as
like async hooks, for example.
Well, yeah, exactly. Very great example, right? Like, yeah, but the value to those is so high that, like, and that's where I think having some indicator, having a structure in place where we can try something out at a little bit of scale too. Like, you can't just say like, oh, well, I publish as an NPM package and it gets 300 downloads a month. Like, that's not valuable to this, right? But like, if we had a process by which the innovation can happen in a way that still aligns with the values out, in a third-party module that interops well and, whatever, but then has to have some sort of proof of usership or value or maintainability or whatever before actually getting merged or pulled into core. Because it's not just whether it's merged or not, it's literally like, do we spend the time to make this a feature of core or not? Right? Because again, HTTP2 I think is a great example. Could have lived as a NPMI HTTP2, I think, this entire time.
It would have been one that required, I think, from my understanding, though, native code, right?
Yeah.
Sure, right. But that's what I'm saying. I don't think that is a problem for the users who want to use it. Everybody at Netflix who uses the gRPC tool set, which is the only heavy usage of HTTP2 we have, is all using massive other dependencies, which are native add-ons. It is just, those go hand in hand. And so those users are totally not perturbed by that need, and therefore would be perfectly comfortable if it also required a HTTP2 native module.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the long-standing area of difficulty is like, what do you include in core, what do you keep out of core, and how do you get it just enough into core, right, to support these things? But I think like your suggestions of like, modules which are under the governance, same governance, like things that are not just, hey, here's a module out in the ecosystem you did yourself, like somehow trying to have a strategy where you can have those different things, but both under the governance of the project might change some of that.
Actually, Wes, the thing you were saying, like you first build a module, see that it gets traction, and then you add it into core. But some things don't gain traction until it is in core, or somehow this is stable and good before people are, you know, actually ready to use it in a larger scale. So then which one comes first?
Well, so
Yeah.
well here, but it's very specifically, if we put it into Express, people would use it. Same with Fastify, right? Like this is where I think the key thing, and this has been missing. You know, we just started the web server framework team earlier this year. So and the package maintenance working group was only started a couple of years ago. So if you really think about it, we had no official outreach to the community for a lot of these endeavors other than the doc site, right? Like we didn't have groups of people who were not necessarily working on maintaining it, but were working on modules that were tightly coupled or very important to the ecosystem as a part of those discussions. And I think we do now. I think those things are, and those avenues could make that difference, right? It could be that we get all of the maintainers of the web frameworks to agree to use our new, you know, the layer we're going to build. And then even though it's not in core, it's still going to, I mean, they're just going to use it because they use the frameworks, right? So we only need to go one level deep to get the usage out of it, right? We don't need to go to everyone.
That's an excellent point, actually, because then we're not targeting the end users, you know, we're targeting the library framework user developers.
Exactly. Right. And I think that really, we tried to talk about this in the value conversation, is we have different end users. We have library authors, we have, well, we have Node Core contributors, we have library authors, which sit directly on top of Node Core, and then we have end users who use a sort of patchwork of all of the different APIs, right? And so which one is the most valuable to us? And I think in this context, the most valuable user is the library author, because very few folks are using Node Core HTTP APIs directly without libraries involved. It's actually almost impossible to do correctly. So like we actually could have that discussion separately, which is like, maybe that means that the Node Core APIs are ultimately not right. But still, today, if we're talking about how do we move forward for the next 5 to 10 years, to me, the correct answer is we get the library, the core teams of each of the first layer libraries involved in these conversations early, so that they are sure that they'll be able to implement whatever wrappers are needed or, you know, APIs are needed. And if we have that, then it can sit outside of quote unquote core, right, for a very long time, but we have still have the guaranteed feedback loop, the you know, maintainability story, like all of those things that we value can still exist. It's just that the code and documentation doesn't land in core until like all the frameworks have implemented it and gone through a year of supporting it, right, or something.
Yeah, and the real answer, the real thing too is, I guess, other than like if it needs native code, like it does make it significantly easier for people to consume if it's part of core. I was just going to say though, like if it's works just as well out of core, then it's a question of why would you bring it in at all? And maybe it comes back down to that consumability side. Like it's easier to consume for some people without native modules. But
I'm going to
earlier. Go ahead. Sorry.
The native modules thing. I'm a little bit sidetracked. I'm going. It's going to be interesting how WebAssembly is, whether that's going to influence that part with native modules or not. Are they going to be WebAssembly modules?
So this is far out of my expertise zone, but I think that those native modules are not all for performance reasons. So even if we can get some performance, well, see, WebAssembly, I still think can't match the performance in some cases anyway, but I could be wrong there. But I think that there's other usage. So like, for example, The gRPC stuff, I think, is just because the maintainers of the gRPC library don't want to re-implement their things in JavaScript or anything and compile it to JavaScript. They just want to have the tooling that works in every language target they support, which is every language, right? I could be wrong there, but if I go look at those modules, they're like one huge mono repo where every language is built from one source.
Right.
I think they just write in C because that's the lowest common denominator, and then they publish the C, the thin wrapper that is JavaScript over the thing that's shared across their JVM and their, whatever other targets they have.
Well, and all, a good portion of Node is basically a wrapper around existing, V8. I guess that's a bad example, but like OpenSSL, HTTP2, for that exact reason that, there's solid implementations that you want to reuse versus, reinvent the wheel and have to maintain that wheel.
Yeah, and even cross compilation is not something they want in a lot of cases, right? Because that adds extra complexity for them to maintain as the maintainers when they, if they can produce a C, a binary out of their C code, and that's like 85% of their code base, then, why would they want to add a new layer when they already have functional things that work with, anyway, that's sort of.
I mean, I think WebAssembly offers some promise. And, I think in a perfect world, because it compiles, in theory, you could take the existing C implementation and compile it down to WebAssembly. But I having been involved in NAPI since the beginning, I've always been asking, like, well, is like WebAssembly going to replace that? And the answer has consistently been no from the people who are, the champions of WebAssembly, because it still hasn't gotten to the point where you would just say, okay, we don't need that anymore. So it may get there, but personally, I think it's still at least 2 or 3 years out if it gets there, or if it's even going to cover all the use cases. So that's sort of a separate thing anyway.
Yeah. Sorry.
But I can see the, like, it's the consumability part. If you do it as a native module, and if you can reach the same performance level, the substantial difference you get by bringing to core is that you don't need the compilers. You don't have to deal with all the different struggles that, sometimes are there. Like, for example, does Express have any native module dependencies?
No, and we strive not to. Don't get me wrong. I'd much rather have a world where we don't need native module dependencies. We're just not in that world, is where we're at. So, like, if we were to have a compelling reason for Express to take on a native module dependency, I have not heard any. We haven't had any compelling reason, so I guess maybe that's the answer there, right?
Right. Yeah.
But what we have had, and I helped with one feature where we made the HTTP1 and Node Core packages optional, so that somebody could provide their own, and they had written some, I can't remember what the person was working on, but this is a couple years ago now at this point. But basically it was like a new HTTP implementation, and it was a native module. And then the idea was you just install it as a, beside Express and pass it to Express.
Right.
Turbo HTTP?
Yep.
What was it?
Turbo HTTP.
Maybe. Yeah, that sounds familiar.
It's Macintosh.
What was it called?
Oh, it wasn't his. No, it wasn't from him though.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but either way, I mean, the point is we have options on ways that we can enable that, and then all we would do is Express would publish 2 versions, one that uses that as its base, and one that uses, we would publish one that's the new API as its base, and one is the existing. That's if they're API compatible. Like if we had a native and a non-native version. Anyway, that's sort of further down the road.
Yeah.
But I just, and I think though, if there was a super compelling reason, we would ship a native module if that was what was required.
Right.
You know, it's like, here's Express 9, because at this point, that's what we're talking about.
Yep.
Right. Well, who knows with the way, you know, anyway, don't want to go down there.
Yeah, it's a separate discussion.
It could be Express 6 maybe, but anyway, a few years from now, and we say, hey, look, it's in the next major version, has a optional dependency on a C, you know, or whatever, a native module. See, optional at this point, it might not be optional. It'd be like whether or not you want. Yeah, if it didn't, if none of the native parts landed in core,
Right.
it wouldn't even be optional. Right. Okay.
Exactly,
So we would say Express 8 is shipping with the new Node foundational, you know,
Yep.
HTTP2 APIs, and it is a C dependency for now. And we would do that as a beta, and we would see how much problems that generated. So I know we would get at least some, you know, compilation errors, because every single C dependency has a slew of people with just the tools not set up or whatever.
Yep.
But like, that's not super hard to answer, because there's pretty good docs from Node Core on those problems. Or I guess it's not from Node Core, it's Node JIP, I think, where the docs are on like troubleshooting your, you know, compilation errors. But
I think like there, yeah, that's certainly, anyway, that's an area that we'd have to explore. But I think back to your original point, which was like having the buy-in from the web server frameworks and to the approach and an agreement versus sticking something in and hoping people use it is definitely a much more strategic approach to take. You know, and tying it back to the discussion, which was next 10 years of Node, trying to have the project have a view on, oh, do we need to take this new technology? And in some cases, it may be like, this is such an important technology, we've got to get it into core as soon as fast as possible to ensure success. Or it could be like, well, no, this is important, but this is like a 3-year out thing, so let's take our time. And, you know, by having, say, all the web frameworks who are going to use the new APIs and stuff, I think you'll come to the better answer on that.
yeah, I think the outcome from this that would be like a line item to add to our values is collaboration with library maintainers or something to that effect, right? Where a highly valued thing would be the communication between libraries that directly consume core APIs, and the core API maintainers themselves should be very strong.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I'm trying to remember where we definitely in the constituencies have those, like the library maintainers called out. And I don't know if we tied that to the values, but like I'm pretty sure there's kind of a consensus is that when you think of users, in a lot of cases, they're really, you know, are users, which supports what you just said.
Yeah, I think the tooling group, the tooling team is a very similar sort of group where it's made up of library maintainers. And like almost every single conversation that happens in that group is like, here's this thing we're doing in all of our libraries. Let's just move it into Node Core. It'd be better, right? So like we talked a lot about adding a new CLI parser, right? And it's like, well, yeah, because we all write CLIs. We all I mean, like 80% of them are using yards. Like obviously some are using other ones, but like most of the big popular ones are using yards. It's like, well, why aren't we discussing what parts of yards can move into core? Like the yards parser, for example, like, you know, or some version of that moving to core would be great. That came out of saying, look, these are what library maintainers are struggling with.
Right.
Right. If we keep that structure where library maintainers, like I would almost verge on saying library maintainers are more important than end users. But I know that might be a contentious one to say in the planning meeting.
Right.
But in a lot of regards, like they're our most important users because they're the ones that actually have the connecting points between end users and Node Core APIs in a lot of cases. So
I would like to add to that, especially in terms of what we're trying to build here with the new HTTP stuff. I mean, I see it more that what we are building should not be an HTTP framework. We should be building blocks and enablers for library and framework developers to do their thing.
So I agree that for our conversation, I think prioritizing library maintainers over end users is correct. That said, I think that should not be a blanket statement across Node. So
I agree with that.
HTTP is so complicated that having a framework, right, or maybe it's not HTTP, writing a web service is complicated enough that having a framework that provides opinions, values, direction is required. To do well, I think that's going to be required. The same thing cannot be said for CLI parsing. The same thing cannot be said for file system operations, right? So I think that in this domain, library maintainers are absolutely the most important, and we should be writing APIs that are a joy for a library maintainer to integrate on top of. But I think that we should have as a very close second end users, because there are certain cases where an end user should be able to use the core API directly and not have to jump through all the hoops to get to work. So I'm thinking, for example, like if I'm writing unit tests and my unit tests need to verify that this one API, I'm not writing a unit test on the API, I'm writing a client, and it just needs to make an HTTP request. Like I should be able to use the Node Core API directly in my unit test to just mock a response object or something, right? Today you can't do that. Good luck. Like it's hard. Go look at what the tools that do that are doing, and they're jumping through a ton of hoops to make that happen, right? So I think that's where finding the balance, like maybe we need two APIs, one that is lower level and then a higher level one that sits on top of it. Like anyway, that's going into solutioning.
No, but
the point stands, I think.
This is a good point. So I think we still, I mean, I'm thinking from my experience with Undici, for example. I mean, in Undici, we have something called a client, which is a one connection, and it implements pipelining, right? That's the base block. And a library developer can take that and do whatever they want. But we also have a reference implementation of how do you handle multiple connections? And there are a lot of complicated issues come up. You know, how do you schedule between the connections? When do you think a pipeline is blocked or not? How, yeah, all of those are really difficult. So I don't think that the Undici, for example, will be able to build the optimal solution for that. I mean, end users can use the simple reference implementation is what I call it, but I would encourage library developers to actually use the low-level building blocks to build something better.
So I mean, better, but so you just even illustrated that there are two use cases here, I think.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to drop off, but I'll make you the owner, Wes. And
oh well, the stream is gonna drop, right?
No, if I make you host, you should still be there.
Oh, okay.
So you are now the host, and I'll leave you because I gotta have a few minutes before the next meeting. Bye.
Okay, no worries. See you later, Michael.
Bye.
So even there, I think. By the way, I'm using Undici now in the tool I'm writing, and it's going well. And I read through, just so that I have context, what you're talking about as the where the complications come in, is that in the pool?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm using the pool, so it's good to know. I didn't know there was some complexities there that maybe are being hidden. But I do think that what you described really is the two use cases. I think there's the end, and and having them both in the library actually is not a problem. And if we did the same thing in core APIs, I don't think it would be a problem. I think that in my tests, which I'm writing, I'm using the client, which is your recommendation. It's like, great, it works out of the box. It's really easy. Like, I'm not worried about pooling because I'm writing like some unit tests, and I'm, it's not about having a production ready HTTP client. It's about like just getting the test written, right? And then when I have say I'm writing a server that was using Undici, I think I would use the pool or something like it. Obviously, we'd want the optimal, I didn't know that it wasn't necessarily considered the perfect solution yet. But like, I think those living in the same API seemed really intuitive to me. And it's like, okay, if you need to use it in test, you use just the client, the bare client, and I make one and I call it and then I destroy it. If I'm in a server context, I use the pool. If this feels a lot to me like the PG module, and it feels totally reasonable to have those under the same API umbrella, the same thing, except there's just the ability to go one level deeper if you are that type of user, right? And that type of user in this case is a library author. But I think that for us to say Node Core never would implement the higher level one is the problem in some.
No, but I agree with that. And we're still not quite there with Undici yet. But for example, pool should not be dependent on any internal magic. So pool is something that should be able to be implemented fully in userland without having to access hidden symbols, etc., on the client. Right.
So why do you think that? Like, just so that I understand your reasoning there.
So for example, I mean, if I look at pool, there are very many different ways to schedule requests on multiple pipelines. Do you schedule the request if you have multiple connections? Do you go breadth first or depth first in the pipelines? Do you have some kind of timeout once the pipeline hasn't made any progress and it's head of line blocking? How do you detect head of line blocking, and when do you determine you open a new connection or not? There's a lot of complicated heuristic that you in theory could want to do, but that leaves out of the scope of that's too complicated to do in that kind of project. If somebody wants to do it separately, go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So the idea is there's probably a good enough solution that would work for 80%, but we know that the 20% will not. And if it requires reaching into private symbols to get that 20%, then that's a problem. And so what you're saying is not necessarily that it should be implemented in userland. You're saying that there are opinions, depending on your use case, where the ability to implement it in userland is critical.
Yes.
And that's what okay.
And maybe userland has a better idea,
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely that.
So okay. I think the pool I see as in one way, it's a reference implementation for people that want to try to build something better. It's a good enough solution for a majority of the users, and it's not tightly coupled to the client. I mean, the client you can use the client and do the same thing if you want outside.
Yeah. So in the case of okay, so you're saying you achieved a client that exposes the right amount of details for the pool to stand alone. You just decided because it was a good API to include it in the library as it was bundled, right?
No, that was Matthias' decision. That was before I came into the picture. But that's how at least my vision of it has evolved. It's not. It's 95% there. There are some things that I mean, the pool doesn't use any hidden symbols, etc., for the client. But there are things I would like to do. For example, I'm writing a reverse proxy where I would like to use Undici, and I need a more complicated implementation than the pool.
Okay.
Currently. And I need more information that is internal, and that somehow needs to be exposed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and these are definitely when we go about designing the version of this that lands in core, presumably as part of this, HTTP rewrite. These are very important questions, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think I agree with Mateo's high level decision, which is have a pool. I think it's because again, I'm using it. As soon as I saw the docs on it, I was like, oh yeah, that's what I want in this case. And so I'm using both APIs, and I think I'm using the Stream API where I provide it the writable or whatever, and then I think in my tests am using the Bear one. So I'm using I think all three in my one first implementation. And to me, that is, yeah, well, it means you did, I think you did it I think that is the correct API. Not everyone's going to need all three. I happen to. And I think if we take the same approach in core, I think we will be doing our users a big favor.
Yeah.
And again, if we have 80% coverage, I think that is pretty good. If we get to the point where it's 50% and we're like, well, we really just can't implement something that is going to get to the 80% of users are happy with it state without moving it and still move it into core, then I think we maybe have to have a critical discussion on whether that's valuable or not.
I'm not sure. Have you seen the fourth API called dispatch?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'd have to relook at the docs, but.
So just to explain the thought there, that is not intended for end users.
That's the one. Yeah, right. And that's the actual underpinnings of all the other ones, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
So if somebody, comes up with a better API than the three existing ones, there you go. You have an endpoint there to do that.
Yeah. See, I think that's a great way to layer the functionality such that you get both the strong end user experience, you get the mid tier for the more advanced users, library authors, and then you have the really low level tier for those who want to go and experiment and innovate, right? Yes. And I think to me that sounds like what Mateo was concerned about when we were saying stability and nobody was ever mentioning innovation. I think that having like what you're describing here is the approach we should take with all of these APIs is have a really strong low level one, have a really good mid-tier story for the library authors, and then have a really good high level one, all wrapped under one umbrella API, but documented in such a way that it's very clearly targeted. These ones are for library authors. These ones are right. Like the streams API is, I think it has good documentation in this sense. It says, here's a stream consumer. And then it has like an example of consuming a stream. And then it says, here's the section for implementers. Right. And like, if we just do the same sort of hierarchical documentation approach and API structure, I think we can do a pretty good job there.
And I also think it's important that, the layers build upon each other.
Absolutely.
They don't go, that's a really important thing for me in Ditchy. The stream API should only use the dispatch. It shouldn't, go in and grab symbols, etc., and depend on the outside of it. Likewise with the pool.
Yep. Yeah. I actually, now I fully understand where you're going with that. And I really agree strongly with that. I like to talk about when I'm talking about systems architecture about making sure that you have single direction dependencies always. Like if, and try not to have like the intertwined web that often people have when they start reaching deeper, right? Is like, well, I depend on this thing that's deeply in there and I skipped a step. So now when that thing suddenly changes, it ends up being like some sort of circular web, or, there's a lot of problems that you can have when you don't respect those layers.
And sometimes those layers come at the cost of performance.
Which is true. So we did have that we're over time, so I don't want to go to, that's another topic, but I think a valuable topic. We did have a small discussion on when performance is battling maintainability or developer experience, which one do we choose? So I think we should, that would be another one to have on the follow-up with the 10-year is like at the cost of perform. Anyway, we could go on the performance track discussion for a while. I think we should wrap it up. Does anybody have any? Do y'all have any closing things? Gene,
No, well, what did we? What is our conclusions here? Focus on library developers.
I think that is a good direction. I would like to hear. I would like to. Maybe we should make an issue on that. I can write that and say we had a really good discussion around the technical values. We think that our goal should be to primarily target library authors as our most important constituency, and then maybe get some feedback from like James, because again, James is going to be very pivotal in this discussion, and then the rest of the folks, and see what people think, and then we can add that to the agenda for the next meeting, and continue that discussion once we've had some asynchronous feedback.
Yep.
And then I'll also take, I think the next 10-year discussion is later today. I think I can,
Yes, I think it's in 2 or 3 hours, something like that.
Okay. Are you going to be at that as well?
I will.
Okay. If I can't make the whole thing, because it also conflicts with my team all hands, I was going to maybe try to balance the two, but do you have a good understanding of what we've discussed, and are you willing to advocate for some of these things in that meeting?
Yes. I didn't speak a lot. I was doing something else also, but yeah, I have a quite good understanding on that. Yeah, and everything that, yeah, the main issue, and I totally agree with most of the thing we spoke about. But I think it's the same issue we have in Express, Fastify, and other stuff, is how we can test before landing something inside core, and how to choose that. But yeah, it's okay for me. I will explain that on the 10-year if you are not here or not able to attend.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. I'll try, but who knows? Okay. So open an issue. We'll bring it up on the 10-year discussion. Then next meeting we'll continue with the, how are we structuring our APIs such that they map to our like technical value hierarchy, or whatever we want to call it. Awesome. Well, I guess that's a wrap. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you all next time.
Yep. See you. Bye.